Hello. Welcome to Work with LGBTQ Initiatives. My name is Wiki, and I am the Community Outreach and Alumni Affairs Intern at WMST. We want to begin by recognizing that we are on occupied land. This is Haudenosaunee land, so take a moment to pause it. Okay, so there are some upcoming events this week. On Tuesday at 7 p.m. in Golden Auditorium, there will be a movie screening of Bound with visiting scholar Keegan, who's here today. On Thursday at 5:30 in Shaw Wellness, take part of the We See You Creative Workshop series. Senior capstone from Taylor. I'm just going to read this if you have anything to add. For my praxis, I have set up a station in the back of Women's Studies dedicated to documenting queer joy and community. Colgate has a terrible track record of documenting the lives of LGBTQ+ students, staff, and faculty, and as a current queer student, I know that we've done some cool shit. It took a lot of research to learn about even a teaspoon of Colgate's queer story, and I don't want the same to happen to a student in the future who wants to reflect on their past. This is why I want to make available a queer time capsule of joy and celebration of queerness at Colgate. Do you have anything to add?
It's in the back.
Like right there, like in the window seals where people are sitting. Cool. Check it out. Okay, so during the presentation and the Q&A, please remember to use microphones to ensure accessibility. Remember to clean up around you, and please discard your trash in the trash cans, which are over there. And if you can, please stay and help place the chairs onto the racks following our intern's instructions. We would appreciate it. So today's brown bag is with Keegan. Keegan is Assistant Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Liberal Studies at Grand Valley State University. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Lana and Lily Watkowski, Sensing Transgender, and his writing is forthcoming in Genders, Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Social Alternatives, Spectator, the Journal of Homosexuality, the Oxford Queer Cinema Handbook, and the Cambridge Companion to Queer Studies. Keegan is an incoming associate editor of Somatenics. Okay. And is co-editor with Laura Horak and Eliza Steinbock of Somatenics 8.1 Cinematic Bodies. He is featured in the upcoming Trans Cinema episode of The Vice Guide to Film. Please, one round of applause too.
Thank you. Hopefully I'll earn your applause with this talk. What I want to check on, though, is visibility. For people who are able to see, is there a screen glare? How are we doing? Can people see the images? All right? Okay. I'm aware that not everyone has great seating, so I'll try to explicate what's on the screen as we move. This is a talk about cinema and aesthetics, so pictures are a necessity, which is why we were so concerned about getting something you can see. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about the question of what makes cinema trans. I think we're in a moment where we're having a lot of these kinds of sort of border wars around what counts as trans cinema, what counts as transcultural production, who gets to make a piece of film about trans people, and kind of the role of cinema in trans politics. And I'm going to talk more about that today. So the title is What Makes Cinema Trans, Aesthetic Gentrification, and the Limits of Representation. So I'm going to talk to you today about some work that I've been doing or had to do in preparation for my forthcoming book, Lana and Lily Wachowski, Sensing Transgender, which is going to be released in the Contemporary Film Director Series at the University of Illinois Press this coming fall. It's the first academic monograph on the Wachowskis. cinema, and it is trying to make sense of their role historically in the production of trans cinema using new methods coming out of trans studies. So I'm going to talk a bit about where we're at in the landscape of trans cinema, why it matters maybe to think about these questions, and then also some new methods that I've developed in my own work on this project and moving forward in the work I'm doing now. So the first thing I'll ask you is, and it's kind of a loaded question, but why might cinema matter to transgender people? What do you think? Any takers? Why is this an important question to begin with?
I think it might matter to transgender people because of representation. It's woefully underrepresented in popular culture. And then it's an important question to consider because if you know why it matters to people, you know what lens you should probably be looking at it with.
So there are two layers to what you're saying, I'm hearing, right? There's like a lack, right? We don't see images of trans people. And then there's also the question of the politics of how that's done, right? Whether it's aesthetic politics or production politics, like how does something get made, and then how does it represent, right? Any other thoughts? Agree, disagree, want to add? Can I just ask you to name some films you think might count as trans cinema?
Actually, that first picture on your slide reminded me because I really liked that movie, but I believe it's called The Danish Girl.
Yeah, let's go back to that, right? This is a film from 2015, right? The Danish Girl that stars Eddie Redmayne as Lily Elba, one of the earliest trans women to undergo medical transition in Germany, right? Yes, we could say maybe that because it has a trans character, right? And it's doing some work to represent trans history. Any other examples? Sorry to make you run around for that.
No, I'm bringing my steps in.
I should have warned you that I was going to do this right off the bat.
That's why I wore comfy clothes.
Tangerine.
Tangerine. Okay. So, wait. Don't move. How is that different from this movie? Have any thoughts?
Because he's portrayed by an actual trans woman and has a trans cast.
Right, so we have trans casting, right? We have trans characters played by trans people, right? So we might think that's better representationally than something like The Danish Girl. Both films are made by white cis male directors, though. So there's the question of authorship as well, right? So again, we're getting into some of the complexities of who gets to make what, how does it get distributed, who's in it, right? What are its politics? We could say that the politics of Tangerine are very different from the politics of The Danish Girl, which is very much about like it's like based on a true story, right? I feel like sometimes those are the only stories we can get out of Hollywood about queer and trans people anymore. I'm like, based on a true story, that's barely true. Versus Tangerine, which is a film much more taking us into the world of trans community. It's like more than one trans person in the movie. Wow, right? Imagine that. Any other thoughts? We've got those two on the board. Yeah.
This is older. I'm probably dating myself, but Boys Don't Cry.
So could you say a bit about that film for all the...
Sure. Well, I don't remember exactly when it came out, and it was, I'm forgetting his name, the character's name, but Hilary Swank played this character that was transgender, and I believe they were in Lincoln, Nebraska, and...
Yes, they were.
Yes, and was that also based on a true story? Was it Matthew Shepard?
Brandon Tina.
Predates
Matthew Shepard by 4 years.
Okay, so there was basically violence involved against this person, and but again, I don't remember who directed that. So that question.
Absolutely. So I'll talk a bit more about Boys Don't Cry. Boys Don't Cry is credited kind of as like the first good film about a trans person, right? It's also based on real events, but takes liberties, right? It is directed by a white lesbian person, right? Kimberly Pierce. At the time, it came out in 1999, so I'm going to talk a bit about the year 1999 later. The interesting thing there is that film at the time was very groundbreaking, but if you look at how the production of it was done, right, what they did was there were two other victims in that murder, one of whom was a black disabled man, Philip Divine, who was like just cut out of the story, right? So you think about like when white trans characters get space, it's often at the expense of like characters of color, right? Like we can't think about trans and race together, and I think we're still struggling to do that. But absolutely, Boys Don't Cry would be like kind of the moment, right? Of like you can have a film with a central lead trans character and it can make money and win awards. It won Hilary Swank Best Actress in the 1999 Oscars, right? So I think y'all are hitting the nail on the head, right? That it's about, by and large, the discussion has been about representation. It's about asserting a certain kind of representational politics. Trans cinema is often thought of as being additive, right? Like we need to add people into the narrative of what cinema tells us is real. So we could think about, right, the history of trans cinema. This is a film from 1972 called I Want What I Want, right? We could think about cinema as a way of actually creating aesthetic languages through which identities can become readable. And a fancy way to say that, right, is simply that popular cinema aestheticizes what we consider to be real. That Hollywood, for the longest time, right, since it's been around for about a century now, has really created the aesthetic structures by which we recognize people as real or lives as real, which is why the question of representation, I think, got brought up right away. We want to see more and better, more accurate representations of people because that signals to us that those people are getting included into our sense of democratic politics, right? So cinema has played this interesting role in trans history where we get these aesthetic strategies for representing trans identification, right? So in the early 70s, this is like right after Stonewall, right? What we see is this use of cinema to create projections, fantasies that become perceivable, right? That's like the way that trans people are kind of being conceptualized in cinema at that time, with the idea of the mirror scene, which is a dominant trope in cinema even now, trans cinema. Danish Girl, the slide I showed you to begin with is a mirror scene, right? So this idea of mirroring what could be, but it doesn't exist yet, but we're projecting fantasy, right? We're saying, I want to be like that, right? Cinema has played a really large role in creating a symbolic structure of trans identities through which we understand them. So, right, there's this term cinematic reality that I'd like you to think about a little bit in this talk. And this comes from Black queer film scholar Keegan and her book, The Witch's Flight. The cinematic, the Black Femme, and the Image of Common Sense, which I really recommend if you're interested in like critical race theory, queer theory, and cinema, right? Great book. In it, she develops this idea called cinematic reality that's really key, I think, to understanding why representation matters so much. In it, right, she makes the claim that over the 20th century, cinema became the technology that primarily organizes our common sense. And I think she means that in a couple of different ways. She means our moral sense, she means our political sense. She also just means our senses, like how do we see, how do we hear, how do we feel, right? How do images work on us? How does sound work? What's possible aesthetically for us as people? When we look at the world, what do we notice? Cinema, she says, is like the technology for building a shared sense of reality. So, right, changes in cinematic technique, style, aesthetics have historically reordered what we perceive as real. So when we start getting things like Boys Don't Cry, right, which is trying to represent a trans person's life, there are a number of aesthetic strategies that come along with that are about trying to make that identity feel real to an audience. Right? How do you communicate the reality of this kind of person that maybe nobody had met or encountered? Right? Another great example from my work is something like The Matrix, right? Which literally it kind of predicted where technology would go, right? So there's this role that science fiction cinema plays in actually predicting what happens when reality isn't real anymore, what happens when you enter the post-modern. And a lot of my work is concerned with how transness is related to this kind of a concept, an aesthetic concept, that there are competing modalities of the real, right? My reality is I'm a man. Other people's reality is you're not, and the trans politics is about having a conversation about how to transform their reality into my reality, right? To get them to see my real. So that's just a concept I wanted to place there for you to kind of ground why this is also important, because cinema makes things matter to people, and it makes them cognizable, which means understandable, right? And my work is all on mass culture, so Hollywood, popular cinema, right? The cinema everyone has access to, and how it changes how we think. So the question is, right, I think when I started this project, I started thinking about changes I've seen in cinema since the global crash in 2008. And I started thinking about how we've got this new wave of trans cinema, right? The Danish Girl is one example I'll talk about in a second, where I'm noticing some similarities across films that are coming out. We seem to be in a new era where Hollywood is attempting to do something with transness that is different and I think problematic. You probably love that word, right? But I'll talk more about, I think it's important to say specifically what is happening when we say something is problematic. What are the effects of it? So I started noticing that, how many people here have a good handle on gentrification, like what it is to people, right? We know that our urban spaces, particularly in the United States, are becoming very white, very elite. There's very little public space left in our culture, right? And what I started noticing was that, and the crash caused the acceleration of these pressures, right? Like gentrification has exploded since then. What I started noticing, because cinema is a mirror for the real, that cinema was becoming aesthetically gentrified. And so if you look at the new films that we've gotten, trans films, right, we get things like this hideous film by Roland Emmerich called Stonewall, right, in 2015. Where what happens is that, my pointer doesn't work on the screen, but Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, trans women of color who were present and part of the instigation of the Stonewall riots, right? This film literally takes the brick out of this character's hand and puts it in the hand of a white, middle-class, Midwestern character, who then starts the Stonewall riots, right? So it's literally like a transfer of power that, right, it's upward distribution, that's what gentrification is. So that I started thinking, what are some of the effects of this? Like, right, dehistoricization, like history doesn't matter, we have a flattening of the historical, like everything is just in sort of, the politics don't matter anymore, right? So there's dehistoricization, there's depoliticization, there's whitewashing, right, which we could talk about a bit, right? There's a lot of that. All of these characters of color that were like on the front lines of Stonewall and this still are in the back behind, they're like backdrop, right? A real effect of gentrification aesthetics is that what was collective gets represented as like an individual story of a hero, right? So here it goes from being like a mass riot that was intersectional, right? It was about a lot of different issues that people shared, to a story about like one white gay kid, right? Named Danny Winters, if you can believe it, right? So the overall result here, right, queer, trans, and color bodies are like literally aesthetically replaced with something else. And if you've read Sarah Schulman's The Gentrification of the Mind, this is how it works, right? Like you take something out and you put something else in that is a mechanism for upward distribution. So the total result of this is like upward distribution of narrative and representational power to, right, white, cis, and homonormative bodies. That then disrupts, it's disruptive innovation is what it is. It disrupts the historical telling of what Stonewall was. My students, when they come into my classes, don't know what Stonewall was. They don't know about the AIDS crisis. They don't know about any of this stuff. And I think Hollywood is partially to blame, right? So this is one example. Let's talk about some others, like the representation of the AIDS crisis in Dallas Buyers Club, right? Which again takes what was a collective movement by, working class, queer people and allies who were trying to get affordable medicine to stay alive, right? It was also, if you've seen United in Anger, you know that movement was intersectional, you know it was cross-class, you know that women were involved, you know that people of color were involved. in this film, the entire discourse around AIDS becomes like, basically it's the work of like one gentrifier who's selling drugs to gay people, right? So, and some of the effects here that we also get along with the white gentrifier, we get, right, kind of like a very, very transmisogynistic, stereotypical representation of like Jared Leto playing a trans woman, like who never even existed. She's just there, right? She's not a historical figure. So again, you can see how this tracks, right? We get these effects. Let's talk about the Danish girl, right? Which I think is a particularly egregious example that people don't realize because they don't know the history of like Hirschfeld's Center for Sexual Research in Berlin. So this is a group of trans and queer people from the 30s with Hirschfeld in attendance, right? His center was this like space for education around queer and trans issues. He showed films there that educated people about his research into queer and trans identities. And this is where, in The Danish Girl, Lily Elba goes to be evaluated, right? And when she gets there in the film, she's all alone. It's empty, right? So again, the film tells this like tragic story about like the first trans woman, which is so not true. But in doing it, it also isolates her, makes her like unique and only, and then, you know, and then tells a sad, tragic story about how she's the only one in existence. When the actual Lily Elba would have known like every trans person in Berlin, basically, right? She would have met other people like her. It would have changed. It would not have, that experience would not have been this experience, right? So again, we get a story of collectivity becoming a story of like individualism and martyrdom, right? So this probably all seems very readable to you, right? Like this is what happens when, you know, cinema tells us a gentrified story about our history, and you can see some of the effects of that, right? But that led me to thinking, well, what do we need to do? Like Hollywood seems really stuck. We don't seem to be getting really good films. Tangerine's an exception. It's not a Hollywood film. It's independent, right? So what needs to happen? Do we need to change? Do we need to like abolish Hollywood? Do we need to dismantle it and hand all the money out to trans people? Yes. I'll take some money, right? Right. I support that. But I also started thinking, like, what goes missing when we get these reactions to this stuff? So I was thinking about there are kind of two ways to deal with the problem. And one, they're both from Foucault's model of desubjugation, where he talks about how to actually access knowledges that are new, right? The first model is to actually, like, it's like lifting up a rock and looking at what's underneath, right? Like, you get the suppressive structure out of the way, so you can get at the like true stuff under it, right? So the first model here would be calls for a new authentic trans cinema through the removal of suppressive structures. Like get all the white cis guys out of directing these movies, right? Burn Hollywood to the ground, like, or radically change the Oscars. They've done some of that work, but they could do better, right? That's one mode, and in this mode, right, we get a focus on precisely what, I forget, person in orange. What was your name?
Oh, Maria.
Maria. So precisely what you said, right? It calls for more visibility, more authentic representations, truer histories, and we want real trans people to be like the authors and actors in these films, right? Like that's one way of dealing with the issue, which is why I think Tangerine got brought up as like a better example than Danish Girl, right? So what that really is about is seeking to address deficits in representation, so that what it does is it seeks to like add trans people to the established world that cinema has already kind of set up for us, right? Like we need to add people back into the narrative. What this results in is some good films, right? Like Tangerine, like a lot of like independent and documentary films are coming out that are like major, right? These films that are doing a better job of actually being historical and political. There's also some fallout though, right? So when Boys Don't Cry was showed at Reed College in 2016, we had this massive protest, right? Where people were saying, you know, this isn't a trans film, you don't know what trans is, right? Stop erasing us with this film, right? And there was this really kind of again, almost like ahistorical backlash to that film being on the campus, because again, like we have this politics of authenticity. We want authentic representations, but does that mean we should throw away the entire back catalog? Right? That's an open question. So I think this is a good model for getting certain kinds of films made. I also think we need other methods, because this method does not get me to my project. This is the method I see out there in the activist community, and I think it's a good one. But it's not, Hollywood is not changing, right? Like, we don't see it effective at the level of like Hollywood film or like popular cinema. We see it more in independent cinema. So what I wanted to do was develop another method, right, for finding a different way of thinking about trans cinema. And this comes from Foucault's other method for desubjugation, which is not to uncover a truth, a pre-existing truth, find the true trans people and give them cameras, right? That's one model. This one is about, right, revealing trans cinema from within dominant culture. So I liken it to pulling a Kleenex out of the box, right? It's always been in there. It's been compressed and hidden and within the strata of those Kleenex. Maybe it's indistinguishable from the other Kleenex. But if you have the right method, you can reach in and pull it out and let it take on its own shape, right, outside the context of its initial sort of archive. So what I wanted to do is change the shape of the inquiry and ask, maybe if we don't go looking for accurate representation, maybe if we don't go looking for true stories, maybe I would find other kinds of cinema that could be useful for thinking about how trans people have, what we've offered to our shared sense of the real in US culture. So here, what I did, right, was try to focus on how trans is already present and contained within hegemonic discourses. Not outside of them or suppressed by them, but within them, hiding, basically passing, right? If you want to be funny about it, use a pun. So I tried to develop new critical methods for thinking about how some cinema isn't about representation, it's about experience and phenomenology. Meaning that trans shows up as a way of organizing the senses or a way of aestheticizing the real. So it's much more about how trans people experience the world and much less about how we appear to it, if that makes any sense, right? And in this project, right, a film that is going to be on display tonight, right, alternative cinema, I started thinking about what it means to have like directors come out as trans, like way after they've made like a huge catalog of films. And what kind of historiographic practices do we need to go back to something like Bound from 1996, right, and add it to the archive of trans cinema, even though it has no trans characters, right? And it's not about trans people, or it doesn't seem to be, right? But what is it doing that is really about an experience of the world that is trans versus an object that is trans, right? So I would really encourage you, if you're curious, has anyone seen this film? Thank you. I have to tell you, trans people love this movie. When I gave a talk at the first International Trans Studies Conference in 2016 on this film, and literally every single person in the room had seen it. So my whole job, I feel like, with this book is just to get people under 30 to watch this movie, and I will be successful. So this movie has gone completely kind of missing in the archive of not only new queer cinema, because it didn't seem to be directed by queer people, or trans cinema, because it seemed to be directed by these like straight guys, right? Straight cis men. But it wasn't. And so how does like the revelation of that much later create a kind of effect where we have to go back in the historical record and think about this film differently, like what it was doing at the time, how trans and queer were in conversation all along, cinematically. I would highly suggest checking it out. So that's the method I used for the book I just finished writing. So I would say, instead of, if we want to be intersectional, we need to think about matrix thinking, we need to think about like three-dimensional thinking, right? Not either or, but both and models. And one thing I was trying to bring to the project was like a both and model for theorizing trans cinema. Like, yes, representation, yes, also phenomenology, yes, true stories, yes, also science fiction, right? How are those things working together historically to map different ways the culture is approaching trans at certain times. So, right, multiple and simultaneous theories of trans cinema help us understand, right, that there's a diversity of trans imaginaries, and there's also a historical trajectory that trans imaginaries have gone through. And cinema is a great way to track those or think about them. So, right, transcultural production. Is cultural production just is it just things trans people make? Or is it actually a meaning-making process by which pre-existing objects attain new meaning through theory, right? That's more my model. Trans politics. There are very different political discourses embedded in a lot of these films that don't agree about, like, should we transcend gender? Should we keep it, but, like, disestablish the systems that make it into a hierarchy? Should we abolish or should we recover, right? Like, what should we be doing? And I don't think we figured that out yet. Like, we still aren't in agreement about the value of those different strategies. I'd like to think we could keep them in conversation and not get too pure about one or the other, right? But it's the conversation. And also, like, how have we aesthetically made sense of trans identities over time? How has that shifted and changed? If we get 100 new Danish girls, is that going to tip the scales of representation? Or is it about the work that a representation does or doesn't do or absolves us from doing, right? So, for example, I'm so glad someone brought up Boys Don't Cry, right? Because it and the Wachowskis' blockbuster, science fiction blockbuster, The Matrix, come out in the exact same year, right? And they are both thinking through in different ways approaches to trans politics, a politics of the real, what counts as real and what doesn't, right? And strategies for addressing imposed realities versus imaginaries, right? They're actually a mirror of one another, which is why I started out showing you that mirror scene from I Want What I Want, because one of the arguments I'm making is that these films are actually, like, mirroring each other's strategies and thinking across. There's, like, this very interesting moment in 1999, right, where we also get, like, Being John Malkovich that year, right, where, like, everything in Hollywood is suddenly trans in some way. And I really am curious, like, what was happening in 1999, right, that caused this to be such a phenomenon? What were the political and material conditions that caused that, right? So I'd like to keep both models in play in my work. And I'm going to talk to you slightly about just two things I'm asking right now, which is, right, this is very small, so I'll read it to you, but a big question I have is, how have trans contributions to cinema and the historical emergence of trans identities or politics been co-constitutive? So again, it means, like, movies make you think things are real or possible, right? But then also we have people, so people are informed by movies, but they're also making movies. So there's kind of almost like a bouncing mirror effect back and forth with, like, the work that cinema does in our culture, right? Where I watched The Matrix 1,000 times. I'm a 90s kid, sorry. And, you know, I watched The Matrix 1,000 times. And then a lot later, I was like, whoops, trans. Is there a relationship between exposure to a trans archive that was unrecognized and, like, the slow accretion of a trans identity over time in my life? I can't answer that question, but I think it's an interesting question. Secondarily, all right, so I wanted to show you this clip from The Matrix, and just pay a little attention to what you see, if you can see it.
I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
Okay. So any thoughts about that clip for folks who could see it? Pick up on anything? I'm serious. Let's be smart watchers of film. I see some people smiling and laughing, so
Well,
yeah, pick
I'll
on you.
just say, I mean, I'm totally a person of the 90s too, and watching that when it came out,
Um,
no, that would never have occurred to me. I have probably not seen that movie in 10 years or more, and seeing that now, it's like, oh my gosh.
So it really, what I hear is that like it really tracks along like a gender abolitionist politics. Did anyone notice anything in the visual field, like the effects we're seeing? I think Eli might know. Yeah, the first thing it says is call trans off received, right? So there's that. But what about system failure?
MF letters.
Right. So the virtual effect, which is an empathization of the binary, right? Actually moves us right between male and female.
I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
So are you like, what? Right, so for people in the back, right, that MNF, we go right through them as we hear about like a utopian politic where like the system is ended, right? And ultimately the Matrix trilogy doesn't solve that problem. It ultimately becomes a comment on sort of like neoliberal governmentality and the stuckness of everything, right? Like we don't want the Matrix, so spoilers. But you can't, that's just something that's too meaningful to let pass, right, I think, in terms of how a certain kind of method or reading practice where you're not looking for character, you're looking for aesthetic effect, right, or you're looking for political structure, right, can literally change what a film means much later in history. And I'm very curious about 1999 and the development of, like, a national trans political movement distinct from gay and lesbian politics because of things like Boys Don't Cry, we thought. It could also be because of this, right? Or this could be a result of that in some strange way. So I think that these things co-constitute one another constantly. And like 20 years from now, we'll be like, oh right, the Danish girl, that did a thing, right? Or that was about gentrification, right? Where you take somebody, push some bodies out of the frame so you can put in the others, right? Another question I'm asking right now in a project I'm working on about trans sound designer Wendy Carlos, who wrote the soundtracks for Tron and The Shining and Clockwork Orange, right, is about trans contributions to 1970s utopic cinematic worlds. And so here I'm asking, like, how has trans cinema altered our shared sense of the real, right? Like, how does science fiction cinema, particularly like the beginning of blockbuster sci-fi, in the 70s, which was social commentary science fiction, Spielbergian, right? How is this revealing for us, because trans people are creating the soundscapes for these films, right? How is trans, rather than being marginal, central, actually, to our understanding of postmodernity, and how cinema has introduced those concepts to us? So here, I mostly just wanted to show you a little clip from Tron, the original Tron. Did anyone see Tron Legacy? Yes. I'm sorry. But Tron is so interesting because it's literally like another film about, like, okay, so in the 80s and 90s, people were obsessed with living inside computers. They were obsessed with it. And Tron is like one of the earliest, I would say, films that kind of successfully aestheticizes what we would call like the coming singularity, right? Like there's no difference between like the body and technology anymore, right? The cinema is struggling to represent that. The sound designed by Wendy Carlos, who developed along with Moog, the Moog synthesizer that developed the entire protocol for electronic music, right? She got there first. She turned analog sound into digital sound, and it's the soundscape is actually like the product of a production process that the film has been trying to think in larger ways about, I think. So I'm just going to show this to you and give you a sense of what these graphics look like. It's really goofy, but the sound is really amazing.
This is modulator for lights. These are jet walls. Copy modulator. Copy modulator. It's roll. Copy roll. 2 and 3. Split out. Take 1. Every game taken, great. Get there!
Evil villains are always like, ah. So, you know, and this is early, I'm in early stages in this question about what is the sound of the future in the 1970s and how is transcultural production related to that, right? But I think when people say on YouTube that they should do a Tron Matrix crossover, they're responding to something about the quality of these cinematic worlds, right? That has to do with a mirroring effect of some kind, right? So that's kind of where I'm headed, and I don't have anything more for you. I'd be happy to chat or nerd out more with anyone who wants to. I'm really hopeful that some people will come see Balance tonight because that film is just so incredible. But yeah, I'm open for questions if anyone wants to. Thank you.
Hi, this is kind of a question about the ending of the Matrix trilogy that you were talking about. Because if I remember right, I've seen it a couple times, but it's been a while. Is it that they leave the Matrix plugged in, but that the humans that are already out are allowed to just kind of stay, like, out and alive, and the machines won't hunt them?
Basically. Yeah, so you're told, like, oh, the Matrix will continue to exist, but people will be given choice about whether they want to leave or not, right? So there's this, like, appeal to kind of, like, liberal choice. What's really interesting, a lot of people wrote about that as a real failure of the series because they wanted to see a movie trilogy about, like, Neo transcending materiality and, like, bending space and time and all that crap, which I write about, and I think it's very trans. But but toward the end of the film, it's like that's not enough. That's not enough of politics, and we need to think about kind of how trans started to get captured by like identity politics, how it started to get fixed as a certain thing. There's a moment in that trilogy where Neo, he thinks he's the Messiah, right? And he's like gonna end everything and be all badass. And then they're like, actually, no, it's all a lie, and you're not. And you're not like, and it's like a revision in the work trans does culturally, where we started to get very fixed ideas of what trans is. Right? So Neo starts to become a critique. And what's really interesting about the end of the film is that Neo stays stuck in a fixed form, like trans kind of loses its radical properties, but there's this like whole black city that gets like revived, right? And it's like kind of this like underground black politics that shows up in Zion at the same time. So the film is really thinking about like the radical potential of like trans deconstruction and like Black Lives Matter basically at the same time. Like the materiality of race cannot be abstracted out of the world. It stays there. So I think that's kind of my read on it. But yeah, like it's messy.
Yeah, I was thinking it was interesting to have kind of if we're thinking about the Matrix as like this gender like male female binary, then that
Right.
people are able to like either choose to stay in it or choose to
Absolutely.
leave it. So
Right. I mean, binary coding, you know, right? And F are just ones and zeros, basically.
Oh, okay. I snagged a brownie. I never did that.
Hi. So I guess I have two questions. The first is a little bit more simple. How are you defining cinema in this instance?
I take a broad view of cinema, which is that it's basically a sensorial experience. So I would count certain kinds of television as actually cinematic, because they are primarily thinking about aesthetic effect on the senses versus like the more kind of narrative concerns of like broadcast television. So I have a pretty broad view, but my work primarily focuses on popular cinema, so cinema that has broad cultural impact and distribution. Yeah.
Great. And my actual question is, it has to do more with genre and sci-fi, because there's a lot of conversation of sci-fi being a realm where marginalized groups get to kind of fantasize and play pretend and kind of do these things. And I'm wondering if you're seeing a lot of these mirroring trends in non-sci-fi films. And I guess another sub-question of that is like, because I'm looking at sci-fi now, and sci-fi now has a very particular kind of feel because it has been popularized. It's mainstream to be sci-fi now. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are, and kind of, yeah.
Wow. So I was joking I teach a class called Gender and Pop Culture, and I was joking with my class. I was basically throwing out like a giant softball because I wanted them to come at me, where I said that like millennials love fantasy and Gen Xers love sci-fi. And they were like, "Oh!" at me, and it got us talking. But I do think that we need to be careful about what science fiction actually is, right? So a lot of the science fiction that you're watching is not actually sci-fi; it's actually fantasy. So there's that. When you think about kind of like the generic effects historically that these genres are set up to do. I do think we're seeing a kind of revolution in science fiction where now we're getting things like Black Panther, which is definitely science fiction, right? It's a more sci-fi take on superheroes because of the role of vibranium, right? And it's kind of like appeals to science. That we are seeing kind of a new awareness of race and Afrofuturism and all this awesome stuff that I think was having a slight moment in the late 90s when The Matrix came out, right? There were like appeals to that. But honestly, there's a lot of just like really ponderous, boring science fiction that isn't really about anything, too, right? Or that is conservative. So like Black Mirror, I think is an incredibly conservative text because it's like afraid of technology, right? It's so humanist. And so I think we need to think more carefully about like what science fiction is like doing, like what its actual function is in the culture. What was the nut of your question?
I think that was kind of the, yeah, I think, well,
Science fiction.
the non-science, oh, I guess
And
also,
non-science.
like, where do we
everything
see?
else.
Yeah, where do we see these mirroring effects in non-science fiction? Because I feel like it's so easy to be like, oh, this is a metaphor for X, Y, Z kind of thing.
Right. So I do think there are more symbolic modes for reading trans and things like so. Basically, if you took The Matrix and turned it into fantasy and not sci-fi, you get something like the Lego Movie, right? Like, which is literally The Matrix, but without any kind of cultural critique, right? Like, it's not a critique of our current political environment. It's like a fantasy about whimsy and being able to do whatever you want. So I think thinking about the politics of those genres is important. I think drama is just really played out. Like, they just keep making these really ponderous, weepy trans dramas. They're just like, I go to them and take notes, and I'm like, ugh, you know? Like, I know the trans person's gonna die. I think Tangerine is really awesome because again, we get collectivity, right? Like, having more than one trans person. And that film is actually kind of like a comedy. If you think about the functions of drama, like tragedy and comedy classically, it's about community and resolution. It's not about failure of, it's not mourning anything necessarily. So I would love to see, I think comedy has been a really toxic place for trans people traditionally because of all the jokes made at our expense. But I'd love to see more actual comedy that's about community and resolution of conflict and the things we need to see in our culture. I think that's a space that I would really like us to see more stuff in and less drama.
Anybody else?
I have a quick question. Oh, somebody else? I have a question.
Thank you. I had just a question in terms of looking for those other futures. If you had contemplated in your book other films outside of the U.S. genre.
I'm an Americanist.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah. But I'm highly aware that when you look at something like the Wachowskis' work, you are dealing in a global consumer environment, right? That particularly their later career, has been very much about getting funding from Europe and Asia to make movies. So there's their Netflix production, Sense8, right? Only got the finale added because people in 16 countries, or people all over the globe in 16 languages demanded that Netflix renew it. So I do think there are new kind of consumer models we need to think about. They're about globality. Yeah. Netflix when that happened, Netflix had just also, now the majority of Netflix subscribers are non-US.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah, and I guess I was just wondering if in your book you were contemplating other kinds of narratives in other films being produced outside of the U.S., France and Spain, and
not as much
parts of Latin America. If we're searching for a different narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm very interested in the Western idea of all of this, and because the project is really clustered around a single set of directors, because I pitched it to Illinois, right? It is a very kind of Western-centric book. Where I'm trying to think through the effects of that on the rest of the world, right? There's this amazing, one of them is So You Think You Can Dance, or it was one of these talent competitions over in Asia where this guy can do the Matrix bend back, and it was amazing to see somebody in Japan do that and the video get 6 million hits. There are certain kind of iconographies of the body that travel because of the influence of the West, right? Ultimately, because I work in a pretty U.S.-based context, I try to be cognizant of the effects of these things on other people. But a lot of this, I'm hearing a lot about Una Mujer Fantástica, right? And these other things that are coming from a non-Hollywood context that could have, it seems like there's other things happening outside of Hollywood that need to be written about. Definitely. Totally.
Anyone else?
You brought up Sense8, which kind of leads us into the world of television. And I've read your article about transparent, or at least a article that you wrote about transparent, maybe more. I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on that a little bit in terms of all of this.
so Netflix is television, but is it? Right? Like, I think it's a weird hybrid form. I think trans parents in for like a cancellation. I mean, after these current things have come out about Tambor and like, it's just too bad. I mean, I think the writing structure on that show where they tried to like, again, add real trans people or like whatever, right? Regardless of Soloway's coming out process, whatever, right? The early model was we're going to get some real trans folks to write on the show and therefore cloak ourselves from critique. But they never actually, like, the fundamental issue was that you had a cis man playing a trans woman as the lead character, and that never changed, right? And that's ultimately what the power dynamics of that ultimately were like unavoidable, right? So, and I have my article about, it's actually an Advocate magazine article about the representation of trans men, right? Like, where are trans men? Where are we? Like, I don't think trans masculinity translates well in these aesthetic approaches that we've seen classically in cinema and television. So we need new, this is what I mean about needing new types of aesthetics, because the dominant aesthetic approaches have been about aestheticizing trans femininity in like these really trans-misogynistic ways, right? So when you try to add a trans man to a show that's using those other processes, it's like, it turns into garbage. Kind of just, so part of the reason why I'm so much more interested in experiential and phenomenological readings than I am in representational readings is because there just aren't any representations of trans guys. There just aren't. It's really only working in this one direction because of patriarchy and, you know, because of patriarchy.
All right. Are there any other questions? Should we leave it at patriarchy? All right. Patriarchy, y'all. I'm sorry.
I would love to see a film that's about destroying the patriarchy found tonight. Yeah.
All right. Let's fuck it up at Found. So if no one has any other questions, another round of applause, please. So yes, Bound will be screened at Golden at 7 p.m. Thank you all for coming. This is our last round back of the semester. Thank you so much for allowing me to have such a successful year with you all. Best of luck to you next week in your finals when I'll be in my office chilling and y'all be studying. But no, thank you so much. If you can help stack the chairs, that'd be wonderful, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, O'Day.
Yes.
It's okay. I go to bed at like 11 and then after whatever also, that's
I told her that because interested people want to come to in a different frame, obviously.
Yeah.
I feel like it's like a similar person when we might go even those questions of like,
And you can
what
like,
about questioning gender? Yes. They're not worried about it. I mean, it's still Tuesday. They know we have to be out. Yeah. Which even, at least maybe you guys do know this. So even if I would love to
how you doing?
I just